Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. The Galactic Apex Assembly hung in the void like a monument to arrogance, which, let's be honest, was exactly what it was meant to be. 50 kilometers of crystalline architecture and compressed neutronium, spinning in perfect synchronization above a dying red giant. Beautiful, sure. Intimidating, absolutely. Subtle? Not even a little bit. Inside the primary council chamber, because of course they called it that, couldn't just call it a meeting room like normal people, 5 species who'd spent the last 3 millennia convinced of their own superiority sat in judgment. Well, floated, sat, hovered. Species-appropriate positioning, really. The point is, they were there, and they were not happy. The Nalkari representative, an ancient thing that looked like someone had given a tree sentience and then made it really, really tired of everyone's nonsense, shifted its root-like appendages with a sound like creaking wood. To its left, the Mortesh delegation, because the military powerhouse species never sent just one representative, oh no, hulked in their exo-cradles, all chitinous plating and barely contained violence. The Jeel floated in their containment spheres, pure energy given form and opinions, crackling with what might have been impatience or might have just been their version of breathing. The Wendar, sleek and serpentine, coiled around their designated spaces with the smug contentment of beings who owned half the galaxy's economy and knew it. And the Orth, well, they just sort of existed everywhere at once, dimensional phasing making them hard to look at directly, which was probably intentional because it made everyone else uncomfortable during negotiations. 5 species, thousands of years of dominance, countless wars won, territories claimed, lesser civilizations uplifted or crushed depending on the mood and the profit margin. And then there were the humans. This is becoming a problem, the Nalkari spoke, its voice like wind through autumn leaves. If autumn leaves were deeply disappointed in you, the humans continue to exceed probability matrices. One of the Mortesh, Warmind Jolanis, yes, they actually used the title Warmind because apparently general wasn't dramatic enough, leaned forward in his cradle. His species didn't really have faces in the way most beings understood them, but the arrangement of sensory organs and armored ridges managed to convey profound irritation anyway. Evolution finds a way, especially when that way involves looking perpetually annoyed. "Exceed," Jolanis repeated, and the translation matrix made his tone drip with disdain. They've won 19 of their last 23 military engagements. 19 against species with superior technology, superior numbers, superior strategic positioning. They should have lost. Mathematics demanded they lose. They did not lose. Perhaps, one of the Jeel pulsed, colors shifting across its containment field in patterns that translated to carefully measured words. We are calculating with incomplete data. Their technology is adequate, Jolanis interrupted, which was apparently rude in Jeel culture based on the way the energy being's colors spiked toward the infrared. But the war mind either didn't know or didn't care. Nothing revolutionary. Nothing we haven't encountered and countered in previous conflicts. Their ships are functional. Their weapons are effective. Their defensive systems are sufficient. There is no technological advantage that explains their success rate. Their numbers, then, a Wendar suggested, uncoiling slightly to gesture with one scaled appendage. Perhaps they commit more resources than our intelligence indicates. We've analyzed 17 separate engagements, the Nalkari responded, its tone suggesting this was not the first time it had explained this. Force deployment ratios are consistently within expected parameters for their population and industrial capacity. In 11 of those engagements, they were significantly outnumbered. They still won. The Earth said something that existed in about 6 dimensions simultaneously and gave everyone else a mild headache, which the translation matrix helpfully rendered as, "Then we are missing something fundamental about their approach to warfare." Which, if we're being honest, was the smartest thing anyone in that room had said in about 3 hours. But the Earth were like that. Insufferably perceptive. Terrible at parties, probably. Assuming they could exist at parties without giving everyone existential migraines. "We invited one of them to explain," the Nalkari said, and somehow made the word "invited" sound like summoned with extreme prejudice. She should arrive shortly. "A human," Jolanis said, and laughed, which in Mortesh sounded like rocks grinding together in a cement mixer. "In this chamber. I'm sure she'll be overwhelmed by the honor and tell us everything we want to know." The thing about arrogance is that it's only impressive until it isn't, and the Apex were about to learn that lesson the hard way. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The chamber doors, massive things that probably cost more than a small planet's GDP, opened with appropriately dramatic silence. In walked Lieutenant Amira, human military attaché, representative of a species barely 300 cycles old in galactic terms, wearing a dress uniform that somehow managed to look both ceremonial and practical. Dark fabric, minimal ornamentation, everything pressed and proper. The kind of uniform that said, "Yes, I respect your protocols," and also, "I could fight my way out of this station if necessary. But let's not get ahead of ourselves." She was neither tall nor short by human standards, neither remarkable nor unremarkable, with the kind of face that suggested she'd seen some things, learned from them, and filed them away for later use. Her eyes swept the chamber once, just once, taking in all 5 species. Representatives, the architecture, the exits, the tactical considerations, probably the catering options if there were any, and then settled into a neutral, attentive expression that gave away absolutely nothing. The silence stretched for a moment, because the Apex expected deference, or fear, or at least some acknowledgement that she was standing in a room full of beings whose civilizations had been ancient when her species was still trying to figure out agriculture. Amira just waited. "Lieutenant," the Nalkari finally said, and if there was a test in the silence, apparently Amira had passed. Or failed. Hard to tell with the Nalkari. "You've been asked here to address a question that has occupied this council's attention for some time." "Happy to help," Amira said, and her voice carried that particular quality of military politeness that meant absolutely nothing about her actual emotional state. She could have been genuinely pleased, or planning 17 different escape routes, or thinking about lunch. Impossible to tell. Humans were infuriating that way. Jolanis shifted in his cradle, armored plates clicking. "Your species has achieved an improbable success rate in military engagements. We wish to understand your doctrine, your strategic paradigm, your tactical advantages." "You want to know how we keep winning," Amira translated, and had the absolute audacity to smile slightly. "Yes," the Warmind said flatly. Specifically, one of the Wendar added, tongue flickering in what might have been curiosity or might have been hunger, tough to tell with them, "we wish to understand your force multiplication factors, your logistics, your command structures, your operational methodologies." The Jeel crackled, colors shifting through what the translation matrix rendered as scholarly interest. "Is there a philosophical component to human warfare? A cultural element we have failed to incorporate into our models? All reasonable questions, really. Clinical, analytical. The kind of questions you ask when you're trying to solve a puzzle, update your databases, improve your own military doctrine by studying an unexpected variable. Amira let them finish. Let the questions hang in the air of the chamber, recycled through 6 different atmospheric mixtures to keep everyone from suffocating on each other's biology. Then she looked directly at Jolanis, because she'd clearly identified him as the primary skeptic, the one who needed convincing, and said, "You want to know how many humans it takes to win a war?" It wasn't a question. Jolanis went very still, which in a species built like an armored personnel carrier with delusions of grandeur was actually kind of impressive. That is one way to frame the inquiry, yes. One, Amira said simply. The silence that followed had a different quality than the one before. This one was confusion, trying to decide if it should be insulted. One, the Nalkari repeated slowly. One, Amira confirmed. Jolanis made that grinding rocks laugh again. One human can win a war. That is your position. That is what you're claiming in this chamber, before this council. That's what I said, yes. The Jeel pulsed with colors that suggested mathematical impossibility having an argument with statistical improbability. Perhaps you misunderstood the question. We're asking about force composition, strategic deployment, the military resources required for successful— I understood the question, Amira interrupted gently, which was probably also rude, but she did it with such politeness that it somehow made it worse. The answer is still one. The Wendar shifted, scales whispering against each other. Is this a human expression, a metaphor we're failing to translate properly? When you say one, do you mean— I mean one human, Amira said, enunciating clearly, as if maybe the translation matrix was the problem, and not the fact that she'd just said something completely insane with a straight face. One human is sufficient to win a war. Jolanis laughed again, longer this time, and was joined by the Wendar's hissing chuckle and what might have been amusement from the Orth's dimensional region, though with them it could have also been indigestion or quantum uncertainty. The Jeel's colors shifted toward what was definitely skepticism, and the Nalkari just sort of creaked in what might have been the botanical equivalent of a sigh. Absurd, Jolanis declared. Mathematically, tactically, logistically absurd. One soldier, no matter how skilled, cannot— I didn't say soldier, Amira pointed out. I said human. The distinction is irrelevant, the Warmind snapped. One being cannot generate sufficient force projection to— Can't they? Amira asked, and there was something in her tone now, something that cut through the laughter and skepticism like a knife through diplomatic pretense. Not quite a challenge, not quite amusement. Something else. Something that made the Orth stop laughing across its dimensional space, and the Nalkari's leaves rustle with something that might have been ancient instinct recognizing a predator. The chamber went quiet again. You don't believe me, Amira said, and it wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Of course we don't believe you, Jolanis said. It's a ridiculous claim. Unless you're suggesting that one human with access to weapons of mass extinction, planet-destroying technology, could— Standard equipment, Amira said. Personal weapons, standard supplies, no orbital support, no weapons of mass destruction, nothing that would violate engagement protocols. Then you're being deliberately obstinate or fundamentally delusional. Or, Amira said, and smiled that slight smile again, I know something you don't. Which, in a room full of species who'd ruled the galaxy for millennia, who'd fought more wars than humanity had recorded history, who'd forgotten more about military science than humans had yet learned, was probably the most insulting thing she could have said. Jolanus rose from his cradle, all 2.5 meters of armored aggression looming over the human who barely came up to his chest plating. You claim one human can win a war. Prove it. How would you like me to do that? Amira asked, utterly unintimidated, which was either very brave or very stupid, or possibly both. We have tactical simulation networks, the Geel offered, colors shifting toward something that looked like scientific curiosity, mixed with the desire to watch someone fail spectacularly. State-of-the-art warfare modeling, used to train our officer corps, test strategic theories, model conflict scenarios. I'm familiar, Amira said. Then demonstrate your claim, Jolanus demanded. One human, against a military force of our designation. We will observe. When your human loses, and they will lose, humanity's petition for advanced trade route access will be denied. Permanently. And when we win? Amira asked. The Warmind's sensory organs arranged themselves in what was definitely condescension. If, by some miracle of probability, that would require rewriting the laws of physics, your single human defeats a military force in simulation, humanity will receive everything it requested and an apology from this council. The other Apex representatives shifted, clicked, pulsed, and phased in what might have been surprise that Jolanus had gone quite that far. But none of them contradicted him. Pride, apparently, was a universal constant. Deal, Amira said immediately, without consulting anyone, without hesitation, without even asking for time to consider the terms, which should have been their second warning sign, really. But pride, as mentioned, is a universal constant, and the Apex were very, very proud. Excellent, Jolanus said, already savoring his victory. Choose your human. We'll configure the simulation for, let's say, one of your soldiers against a battalion of Mortesh elite warriors. 300 trained combat specialists should make your defeat appropriately educational. 300, Amira repeated. Standard engagement rules? Absolutely standard. No artificial advantages. We'll even use terrain modeling of a contested moon in neutral space. Real topography. Real conditions. Fair and balanced. How generous, Amira said dryly. Who will you send? The Nalkari asked. Your finest general? Your most decorated combat veteran? The human you believe can achieve the impossible? Amira pulled out a communication device, primitive by Apex standards but functional, and spoke into it briefly. Request Corporal Lani be diverted to the assembly station for tactical demonstration. Priority routing. Then she put the device away and looked at the assembled representatives of Galactic power with perfect professional calm. Corporal. The Geel pulsed, colors flickering with confusion. Not a high-ranking officer? Not even an officer at all. One of the EEE, Wendar observed. A corporal is, what, second or third tier in human military hierarchy? Something like that, Amira agreed. Jolanus laughed again, because apparently he hadn't learned yet that might be a bad idea. You're sending a low-ranking soldier to prove that one human can win a war. This will be over in minutes. Maybe, Amira said, and moved to one of the observation stations, settling in with the patience of someone who'd seen this before, who knew how it ended, and was just waiting for everyone else to catch up. The Apex exchanged glances, or their species-appropriate equivalents, that all conveyed the same message. Humans were either incredibly stupid or incredibly confident, and they were about to find out which. Narrator's note, they were about to find out it was neither, which was somehow worse. The simulation networks activated, holographic displays blooming throughout the chamber, showing terrain, force positions, tactical data. A contested moon, all rust-colored stone and thin atmosphere, with just enough gravity to be annoying and enough terrain features to make it interesting. 300 Mortesh warriors, positioned in standard deployment patterns, with full intelligence support and communication networks. And somewhere on that simulated moon, about to be inserted at dawn, one human who hadn't even arrived yet. Amira settled back to wait, still wearing that slight smile, and if anyone in that chamber had been paying attention, really paying attention, they might have noticed that it wasn't the smile of someone hoping for the best. It was the smile of someone who already knew how the story ended. But the Apex weren't paying attention to her anymore. They were too busy preparing to watch a human lose. Which, and we really cannot stress this enough, was a mistake. Corporal Lani arrived 30 minutes later, which was apparently fast for intersystem transport, but felt like an eternity in a room full of beings actively imagining their victory speeches. She came through the chamber doors looking exactly like what she was, tired, confused, and moderately annoyed at being pulled from whatever she'd been doing. She was, and let's be clear about this, completely unremarkable. Average height for a human, which made her short compared to most species in the room. Dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that had seen better days. Uniform clean, but lived in, with the kind of creases that suggested she actually worked for a living instead of attending ceremonial functions. Her eyes swept the chamber with mild curiosity, landed on Amira, and her expression shifted to something like resignation. "Ma'am," she said, saluting properly because apparently humans did that, even when surrounded by alien dignitaries who found the gesture quaint. "Lani," Amira acknowledged. "Thank you for coming on short notice." "Didn't really get a choice, ma'am, but sure. What's this about?" Jolanis made a sound that the translation matrix struggled with, eventually settling on rendering it as derisive amusement. This is your champion? Your singular human who will demonstrate the impossible?" Lani looked at the war mind, then at Amira, then back at Jolanis. "I'm sorry. What now?" "You're going to run a simulation," Amira explained calmly. "One human, you, against 300 Mortesh elite warriors. Standard engagement, real terrain modeling, full tactical parameters." 300, Lani repeated. 300, Amira confirmed. "Elite warriors." "That's what they tell me." Lani was quiet for a moment, and something flickered across her face that might have been calculation or might have been the expression of someone wondering if their commanding officer had finally lost it. "And I'm doing this because I told the council that one human could win a war, and they'd like a demonstration." "Right," Lani said slowly. "Ma'am, you know I'm in logistics, right? Supply chain coordination. I file requisition forms. That's mostly what I do." The Wendar made a hissing sound that was definitely laughter. "A logistics coordinator, not even a combat specialist. This becomes more entertaining by the moment." "Do you need a combat specialist?" Amira asked her, and there was something in the question, some weight that suggested it wasn't really a question at all. Lani met her eyes, and whatever she saw there made her straighten slightly. "No, ma'am. Just wanted to make sure everyone knew what they were getting." "Oh, we know," Jolanis said, and the condescension was so thick you could have built infrastructure with it. "We're getting a human who processes paperwork, sent to fight 300 of the finest warriors in Mortesh history." We're getting a lesson in why humans should know their limitations. Okay, then, Lonnie said, and shrugged in that particularly human way that could mean anything from acceptance to concealed violence. Let's get this over with. I've got inventory reports due tomorrow. The simulation technicians, Jill, naturally, because they were the technology species, began configuring the parameters. Standard human equipment was materialized in the simulation: basic armor, standard weapons, field rations, communication gear, nothing exotic. The kind of loadout any human soldier might carry into a contested zone. The Mortesh Battalion received their orders. Eliminate the human. Protect the strategic communications relay positioned in the Northern Highlands. 300 warriors, full equipment, complete tactical support, orbital reconnaissance data, real-time communication networks. Everything you'd need to hunt down and eliminate a single target on a moon roughly the size of a small continent. Insertion at dawn, one of the Jill announced, colors pulsing with clinical efficiency. Simulation runs for 48 hours maximum, though we anticipate resolution within 6 hours given the force disparity. Generous, Amira murmured. Your human will be given full briefing on the mission parameters, the Nalkari said, leaves rustling with what might have been something approaching sympathy. She'll understand the tactical situation, the terrain, her objective. Which is? Lani asked. Survive and destroy the communications relay, Jolanis said. Simple enough. Of course, you'll have 300 of my finest warriors hunting you, so survival seems unlikely. But possible, Lani said. Technically, yes. Mathematically, no. Good enough, Lani said, and moved toward the simulation chamber, a smaller room adjacent to the council chamber where she'd be inserted into the tactical network. Full sensory immersion, complete environmental modeling, everything except actual death if she failed. Just the simulated kind, which was apparently less permanent but equally educational. She paused at the door, looked back at the assembled Apex representatives, and smiled slightly. Not Amira's knowing smile, but something else. Something that looked almost apologetic. Just so we're clear, she said. When this is over, and you're all wondering what happened, remember that you set the rules. You chose the terrain. You decided on 300 warriors. This isn't us being unfair. This is you being unprepared. Then she walked through the door before anyone could respond. The chamber was silent for a moment. Unprepared, Jolanis repeated and laughed. Unprepared for what? A logistics coordinator with delusions of adequacy? I suppose we'll find out, Amira said, settling into her observation position as the holographic displays activated, showing the moon's terrain in perfect detail. The 300 Mortesh warriors in their positions, and one human, alone, standing on a rust-colored ridge as the simulated sun began to rise. The hunt was about to begin. And the Apex, despite having every advantage, every piece of tactical superiority, every reason to be confident, were about to learn something important about humanity. Specifically, they were about to learn why you should never, ever give a human a problem to solve, and then assume they'll solve it the way you expect. The simulation clock started. Dawn broke over the contested moon, and Corporal Laney, logistics coordinator, requisition forms specialist, absolutely not a combat specialist, looked at the 300 warriors hunting her and got to work. The first 6 hours were, from the Mortesh perspective, entirely satisfactory. Textbook, even. The kind of operation they'd run 1,000 times against 1,000 different enemies. Refined to the point of art. 300 warriors divided into 15 squads of 20. Sweep patterns optimized for maximum coverage. Communication networks humming with efficient coordination. Orbital reconnaissance fed them real-time data on movement, thermal signatures, anything that might indicate their target's position. They moved with the confidence of apex predators who'd never encountered anything they couldn't eventually corner and kill. Lani ran. This was, the apex observers noted with satisfaction, exactly what they'd expected. She'd materialized on that ridge at dawn, taken approximately 90 seconds to survey the terrain, and then immediately started moving away from the advancing Mortesh forces. Not panic running. Humans were surprisingly good at conserving energy even when terrified, but definitely the behavior of prey that understood it was being hunted. Predictable, Jolanis observed from his position in the council chamber, watching the tactical displays track both the Mortesh advance and the single human signal moving through a canyon system. She's attempting to use terrain to mask her position, but with our reconnaissance capabilities, it's only delaying the inevitable. She's maintaining good pace, one of the Wendar noted, almost reluctantly. Efficient movement, minimal wasted energy. Not untrained, at least. Training matters little against overwhelming force, the Warmind replied. First contact in approximately 2 hours, given current movement patterns. Then it ends. Amira said nothing, just watched the displays with that same patient expression, like someone waiting for a package they knew was coming, but wasn't going to spoil the surprise. Hour 3. Lani crossed a plateau, disappeared into a cave system. The Mortesh adjusted their sweep patterns, began closing the net. 2 squads moved to seal the cave exits. The rest maintained their cordon, tightening the perimeter. Hour 5. Thermal signatures detected movement deeper in the caves. 3 squads entered to flush her out. The coordination was beautiful, really. Centuries of military doctrine made manifest in synchronized movement and overlapping fields of fire. Hour 6. The 3 squads in the caves stopped responding. Communication failure, one of the Jeel announced, colors flickering with mild concern. Squads 9, 12, and 15 have gone dark. Jolanis leaned forward. Define dark. No response to hails, no telemetry, no life sign data, complete signal loss. Simulation malfunction? Checking. The Jeel pulsed through several color sequences that probably meant it was running diagnostics. Negative. Simulation integrity is intact. The loss appears genuine. Send 2 squads to investigate, the Warmind ordered. Squads 3 and 6, diverted from the perimeter, moved toward the cave entrance with weapons ready. They found squads 9, 12, and 15 approximately 30 minutes later. Alive. Unconscious. Stripped of weapons, communication gear, and most of their equipment. And on the armor of the squad leader from 9, scrawled in rust-colored dirt that matched the moon's surface, a message. Counting to 300 is going to take a while. The council chamber went very quiet. She incapacitated 60 warriors, the Nalkari said slowly, leaves rustling with something that might have been surprise. Without killing them? She couldn't have, Jolanis snapped. 60 Mortesh, even in confined spaces, even with surprise. The mathematics don't work. And yet, Amira said mildly, speaking for the first time in hours, there they are. The holographic display showed the 60 unconscious warriors being discovered by their comrades. It also showed that Lani was no longer in the cave system. She'd somehow slipped out during the confusion, was now moving along a ridge 3 kilometers away, and appeared to be carrying significantly more equipment than she'd started with. Replay the cave engagement, Jolanis demanded. The Jeel complied, pulling up the tactical recording. What they saw was educational. Lani hadn't fought 60 warriors at once. She'd fought them in groups of 3 and 4, in narrow passages where numbers meant nothing, where the Mortesh couldn't bring their full strength to bear. She'd used the cave acoustics to make them think she was in multiple places. She'd collapsed tunnels behind her, separating squads. She'd used their own tactical lights against them, creating blind spots and shadows. And she'd moved through those caves like she'd built them herself, exploiting every geographic advantage, turning their attempt to flush her out into a trap that they'd walked into with military precision and walked out of unconscious. Acceptable performance, the Wendar admitted grudgingly, against surprised opponents in favorable terrain using guerrilla tactics. But she cannot repeat this. The others will be prepared now. Will they? Amira asked, and there was something in her tone that made several of the observers distinctly uncomfortable. Hour 9. The Mortesh command structure implemented new protocols. No more small squad actions. Minimum group size of 40 warriors, always in open terrain where they could support each other, where numbers would matter. Hour 10. Supply Depot 3 reported equipment missing. Food, water, medical supplies. No sign of forced entry, no indication of how it had been accessed. Just gone. Hour 12. Squad 2 found their communications gear broadcasting false signals. They'd been carrying enemy position data to the other squads for the past hour. Wrong position data. Data that had sent 3 other groups on a 6-hour march to absolutely nothing. Hour 15. Water sources in the northern sector were contaminated. Not fatally, just enough to cause gastrointestinal distress. 60 more warriors were combat ineffective, not from injury, but from what the translation matrix delicately rendered as digestive difficulties. The Apex observers were no longer bored. She's not trying to fight them, Unla pulsed, colors shifting to something like reluctant admiration. She's trying to make them unable to fight. It won't work, Jolanis insisted, but his sensory organs were arranged in patterns that suggested he was no longer quite as confident. We still have operational warriors. Numbering? 180, the Jeel provided, accounting for casualties, illness, and Squad 4, which appears to have gotten lost in a canyon after their navigation equipment was sabotaged. Lost, one of the Wendar repeated. How does an entire squad of elite warriors get lost? Someone, Amira said, still watching the displays, switched their navigation markers. They've been following a route that's taking them in circles for about 3 hours now. She can't access their equipment remotely, Jolanis protested. The encryption alone. She's not accessing it remotely, Amira interrupted gently. She's taking it from the warriors she's already incapacitated, modifying it, and putting it back before anyone realizes. Then those warriors rejoin their units and spread the corrupted data through the network. The Warmind was silent for a long moment. That would require intimate knowledge of Mortesh military technology. Or, Amira countered, it would require someone who understands that all military technology has the same basic vulnerabilities. Communication needs connectivity. Connectivity needs protocols. Protocols can be exploited. She doesn't need to know your specific systems. She just needs to understand systems in general. Hour 20. The Mortesh battalion was fracturing. Not broken, not routed, but fragmented. Trust in equipment was eroding. Trust in intelligence was compromised. Warriors were second-guessing orders, questioning whether their communications were secure, whether their position data was accurate. Lani still hadn't engaged in what anyone would call a fair fight. She'd captured and incapacitated warriors in groups of 2 and 3, always on her terms, always when they were isolated or distracted. She'd sabotaged supply lines, corrupted data streams, turned their sophisticated technology into a liability. She'd used Mortesh equipment to send false orders, create phantom threats, make 300 warriors chase shadows, while she systematically dismantled their ability to function as a coordinated force. "This is not warfare," Jolanis said, and for the first time, he didn't sound angry. He sounded unsettled. "This is something else." "No," Amira corrected. "This is exactly warfare, just not the kind you've been fighting." Hour 24. Halfway through the simulation period, the Mortesh had 105 operational warriors. Not because Lani had killed anyone, she hadn't, but because she'd made functioning as a military unit almost impossible. "She's treating them like a logistics problem," Unla observed, colors pulsing with what might have been understanding or might have been horror. Not enemies to defeat, but a supply chain to disrupt. "She said she was in logistics," Amira reminded them. The Nalkari shifted, roots scraping against the floor. "How long can she maintain this pace? Humans require rest, sustenance. She's been in constant motion for 24 hours. She's been eating Mortesh rations," the Jeel reported, checking the simulation data. "Drinking from their water supplies before contaminating them. Resting in their own supply depots while they search for her elsewhere. She's not sustaining herself. She's making them sustain her." "Resourceful," one of the Wendar admitted. "Terrifying," another corrected. On the tactical display, Lani was moving again, this time toward the northern highlands, toward the communications relay, toward her actual objective, which everyone had sort of forgotten about while watching her systematically take apart a battalion. The remaining Mortesh forces, recognizing the same thing, began consolidating around the relay. Final defensive position. 105 warriors against one human, in open terrain, with clear fields of fire. "Finally," Jolanis said, "a direct engagement. No more tricks, no more shadows. Let's see how she handles actual combat." Amira just smiled that smile again and said nothing, which should have been a warning. Hour 30. Lani approached the relay position, the Mortesh prepared for glorious battle. And somewhere in the highlands, carefully placed charges, made from Mortesh explosives that had gone missing from Supply Depot 3, began their countdown. The thing about setting up a perfect defensive position is that it requires infrastructure. Communication lines, supply routes, established fields of fire, fallback positions, all very sensible, all very military, all very predictable. Which meant that Lani had known exactly where the Mortesh would make their stand roughly 6 hours before they'd made the decision themselves. The communications relay sat on a plateau in the northern highlands, a position with excellent visibility and terrible approach angles for attackers. 105 Mortesh warriors had fortified it with the kind of efficiency that came from thousands of years of military tradition. Overlapping defensive positions, clear sight lines, nowhere for a single attacker to hide or maneuver. It was, tactically speaking, a perfect place to die heroically. Lani had no intention of dying heroically. She appeared on a ridge approximately 2 kilometers south of the relay position at hour 32, clearly visible to the defenders. Just standing there, outlined against the rust-colored sky, looking at the fortified position with what might have been consideration, or might have been someone doing math in their head. "Finally," Jolanis breathed, leaning forward in his cradle. "She's going to attempt a direct assault." "Is she?" Amira asked, which should have been a clue, but the war mind was too focused on the displays to notice. Lani raised one hand in what might have been a wave, or might have been a salute. Hard to tell at that distance. Then she turned and walked back down the ridge, disappearing from view. The Mortesh defenders waited, weapons ready, for an assault that didn't come. 10 minutes passed. 20. 30. "She's repositioning," one of the Wendar suggested, "seeking another approach vector." "There are no other approach vectors," Jolanis said firmly. "The plateau is exposed on all sides. She'd be visible for the entire approach from any direction. She'd be neutralized before reaching weapon range." 45 minutes. One of the Mortesh commanders in the simulation sent out a reconnaissance patrol. 6 warriors, moving cautiously toward where Lani had been spotted, scanning for traps or ambush positions. They found neither. They did find a series of small markers, rocks stacked in cairns, leading from the ridge down into a valley system and then up toward a different section of the highlands. A trail, essentially. One that had definitely not been there before. "She wants us to follow," the patrol leader reported. "It's obviously a trap," the Mortesh commander responded. "Obviously," the patrol leader agreed. They followed anyway, because what else were they going to do? Let a single human dictate the terms of engagement? Which, in retrospect, was exactly what they'd been doing for 32 hours. But pride is hard to overcome even when you're watching it destroy you in real time. The patrol followed the markers through the valley, around a series of rock formations, up a slope that required some climbing. Hour 35 now, and they were about 3 kilometers from the relay position, which meant 3 kilometers from the bulk of their forces. They found Lani sitting on a rock, eating what appeared to be Mortesh rations, looking for all the world like someone on a lunch break. "Finally decided to fight?" she asked, which the translation matrix rendered in perfectly understandable Mortesh. The patrol leader, credit to his training, didn't immediately open fire. "You should surrender. You fought well, demonstrated capability, but this ends only one way." "Does it?" Lani asked, genuinely curious. "You're outnumbered, outgunned, trapped in a mission you cannot complete. Surrender with honor." "Honor," Lani repeated, like she was tasting the word. "Right. Here's the thing about honor, though. It's great, don't get me wrong, really valuable in maintaining unit cohesion and morale. But it's also kind of a luxury, you know? Something you can afford when you're winning." "And you believe you're winning?" "I mean," Lani gestured around at the surrounding terrain. "I'm not the one who just walked 6 warriors 3 kilometers away from the defensive position they're supposed to be protecting to chase someone who's been making them look foolish for 35 hours. So, maybe." The patrol leader processed this, realized she was right, realized they'd been baited away from their position, realized that 3 kilometers was a significant distance to cover if something happened back at the relay. Realized all of this about 15 seconds too late. The explosions weren't loud. The thin atmosphere didn't carry sound well, but they were visible. A series of carefully controlled detonations along the ridgeline above the relay position. Not hitting the position directly, that would have been too difficult to arrange, but hitting the slope above it. The slope that was mostly loose rock and accumulated sediment from 10,000 years of erosion. The slope that had been just barely stable enough to support its own weight, until it wasn't. The avalanche that buried the communications relay and scattered the defensive positions was, the GEO's sensors reported with clinical precision, entirely consistent with natural geological processes accelerated by strategic application of explosive force. Nothing that violated the simulation rules, nothing that required technology beyond what Lani had access to. Just physics, geology, and really excellent planning. The patrol leader stared at the distant dust cloud, then looked at Lani, who'd finished her rations and was standing up, brushing dust off her uniform. "You didn't even fight us," he said, and the translation matrix caught something in his tone that might have been outrage or might have been respect. Hard to tell. Didn't need to, Lani said. Fighting is what happens when planning fails. I planned. The relay is currently under approximately 6,000 metric tons of rock. Yeah. Mission objective complete. Now, you and your squad can either try to stop me from walking back to my extraction point, which would be exciting but ultimately pointless since I've already won, or you can head back and help dig out your people. Who are alive, by the way? I checked the calculations 3 times. Some broken bones, probably. Some bruises, definitely. But the defensive positions should have protected them from the worst of it. Probably want to hurry, though. The patrol leader made a decision that probably saved his career. He turned his squad around and started running back toward the relay. Lani watched them go, then looked up at where she somehow knew the simulation observers were watching from, even though that shouldn't have been possible, and shrugged. 39 hours, she said to the air. Can I go back to my inventory reports now? The simulation ended. The council chamber was silent except for the faint hum of environmental systems and the Geel's colors flickering through what might have been the energy being equivalent of stunned disbelief. Jolanis hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, just stared at the tactical displays showing the final positions. 1 human, mission accomplished, 0 casualties inflicted, and a battalion of elite warriors who'd been systematically dismantled without a single traditional engagement. She didn't fight, the Nalkari finally said, leaves rustling with something that might have been awe or might have been horror. She didn't fight at all. No, Amira agreed, she didn't. She treated them like a supply chain, Unla pulsed, identified dependencies, created cascading failures, exploited systemic vulnerabilities. The avalanche, one of the Wendar said, that required geological survey data, explosive placement calculations, timing coordination. She's a logistics coordinator, Amira interrupted. That's literally her job. Moving resources from point A to point B, identifying bottlenecks, solving distribution problems. She just applied the same principles to warfare. But the technology exploitation, the tactical awareness, the psychological manipulation, all things humans learn, Amira said simply. Not because we're warriors, because we spent 10,000 years fighting each other before we ever reached the stars. The doors opened. Lani walked in, looking tired and slightly disheveled from 39 hours of simulated combat, but otherwise fine. She spotted Amira, nodded, then noticed the assembled Apex representatives staring at her. Was that okay? She asked. I wasn't sure about the avalanche timing, but the geology scans suggested. How? Jolanis interrupted, and his voice was very quiet, which was somehow more disturbing than when he'd been loud. How did you learn to fight like that? Lani looked genuinely confused. I didn't fight. I just solved the problem. The problem of 300 elite warriors. The problem of completing an objective against superior forces, Lani corrected. The warriors weren't the problem. They were just part of the system. You disrupt the system, the warriors become irrelevant. Where did you learn this? The Nalkari asked. Lani shrugged. Basic training, I guess. History classes? I mean, humans have been doing this for forever. Guerrilla warfare, asymmetric tactics, insurgency operations. We've got thousands of years of examples. Little groups beating big groups because the little groups couldn't afford to fight fair. But you're not a combat specialist, Unla pulsed. No, Lani agreed. I'm really not. I mostly just make sure food gets where it needs to go, and ammunition doesn't end up on the wrong transport. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? The Apex representatives exchanged looks, or their equivalent. What point? The Wendar asked carefully. Amira stood, moving to stand beside Lani. The point is that when you asked how many humans it takes to win a war, you were asking the wrong question. You were thinking about combat strength, technological advantage, strategic superiority, all the things you've used to dominate the galaxy for millennia. And, Jolanis prompted, and humans don't have those things, Amira said. We're newer, smaller, less advanced. So we learn to win anyway. Not through strength, but through stubbornness. Not through superior technology, but through creative application of whatever we have available. Every human carries the accumulated experience of thousands of wars we fought against ourselves. Wars without rules, without honor, without any of the structures you rely on. You fight dirty, one of the Mortesh officers said. We fight smart, Amira corrected. There's a difference. Is there? The Nalkari asked. Lani didn't violate any of your rules, Amira pointed out. She didn't use prohibited weapons, didn't call for orbital support, didn't break engagement protocols. She just refused to fight the battle you wanted her to fight. She fought the battle she chose instead. The Jeel's colors shifted through several sequences before settling on something that looked like reluctant understanding. You unified your species after your conflicts, yes? Eventually, Amira confirmed. Most species achieve unity before reaching technological maturity, before space travel. You didn't. No, we brought our wars with us. All the lessons, all the tactics, all the ugly, brutal efficiency of species-level conflict. And every human knows these lessons, the Nalkari said slowly. Every single one, Amira agreed. Lani isn't special. She's not a secret weapon or a unique asset. She's just a human who understands what every human understands. When you're outmatched, you change the match. Lani raised her hand slightly, like a student in class. Can I ask a question? Of course, Unla pulsed. Why did you assume 300 warriors would win against one person? Like, genuinely, what was the logic there? Jolanis made a sound like grinding rocks, but quieter, more tired. Superior numbers, superior position, superior technology. Right, but all of those are advantages in a specific type of fight, Lani said. The type where everyone agrees to fight the same way. I just didn't agree. And if we'd sent 600 warriors? The Warmind asked. Lani considered this seriously. Would have taken longer, but the approach would be the same. Bigger systems have more points of failure, more communication networks to disrupt, more supply lines to sabotage, more coordination requirements to exploit. Past a certain point, adding more soldiers becomes a liability. The silence that followed was the sound of several civilizations realizing they'd fundamentally misunderstood warfare. Our petition, Amira said quietly, for advanced trade routes. Jolanis sighed, which in Mortesh sounded like rocks settling. Granted, along with the Council's apology. Appreciated, Amira said. And a request, the Nalkari added, that humanity consider sharing tactical doctrine, teaching methods, training protocols. We'll consider it, Amira said neutrally. Lani glanced at her commanding officer. Ma'am, can I go back to my actual job now? Those inventory reports really are due tomorrow. And if the ammunition shipment gets delayed again, Logistics Command is going to... Go, Amira said, smiling. And thank you. Lani saluted, nodded awkwardly to the assembled representatives of Galactic Power, and left. Just walked out. Back to filing requisition forms and managing supply chains and being completely, utterly unremarkable. Except she wasn't. None of them were. That was the point. "One human," Jolanis said quietly, after Lani had gone. "One human," Amira confirmed. "Terrifying." "Yes," Amira agreed. "Yes, we are." She left shortly after, returning to whatever human attachés did when they weren't humiliating galactic powers, leaving the apex to contemplate their new understanding of the universe. Somewhere in human space, thousands of people like Lani went about their days, filing paperwork, coordinating logistics, living ordinary lives, each one carrying the accumulated knowledge of 10,000 wars, each one capable of looking at impossible odds and asking, "But what if I just don't fight fair?" Each one a reminder that the most dangerous species in the galaxy wasn't the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced. It was the one that had never learned to quit. The Apex learned this lesson well. They never asked how many humans it took to win a war again. They were too afraid of the answer